This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is from our Protecting Animals series where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. Now, quick word from our sponsors. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is working hard to bring animals into universities, but they need your support. So if you're someone who's working in higher ed and you're interested in animal issues, think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. And our other sponsor is, of course, Animal Publics. Animal Publics is the go-to place for animal studies scholars who want to publish on animal issues. It's part of the University of Sydney's publishing house. So if you've got an animal issue that you want to discuss, think about publishing with Animal Publics. Okay, let's get down to business. I'm here in beautiful Melbourne town, one of my most favourite places in the whole world, and I'm really excited to bring you this week's guest. Now, this week's guest is going to be very well known to many listeners, probably known to every single person listening in Australia, and it is, of course, Philip Wollen. Philip was a senior executive in corporate banking, Citibank and Citicorp, but people listening to this program will know him no doubt as a prominent vegan, animal rights advocate, founder of Kindness House. So welcome to the podcast, Philip.
Thank you, Siobhan.
So Philip, can you start by telling us what inspired you to get involved in animal protection?
Well, I never really expected my career to take such a radical change so early in life. I've always believed that everyone should have at least 3 careers, and I had established myself quite happily in the merchant banking area. I was the vice president of Citibank in the mergers acquisitions business for many years. But in my late 30s, we won a mandate to handle an extremely large corporate transaction with a very large organization, which straddled many different industries. You just named the industry and they owned something in it. So as part of my job, I went down with the board of this particular company to inspect their various operations. And one of their operations turned out to be a slaughterhouse. Now, one has to remember in those days I was a meat eater. I didn't know any better, a fact for which, in fact, I've often said that, in those days I really didn't have a clue about what actually happened in our food production process. And that's what occurred then made me decide to leave the world of lobsters and Learjets in exchange for shelters and slaughterhouses. But in this particular assignment, I discovered that one of their businesses turned out to be a slaughterhouse. And what I saw that day absolutely terrified me. And that evening I decided to go vegetarian. But I didn't know enough to even make a rational assessment of the food industry. I still thought that dairy was a bucolic, beautiful, scenic picture of cows grazing in a meadow beside streams and Shelley and Wordsworth. But then I happened to be on a business trip to India, and I saw a dairyman dragging his injured cow to the slaughterhouse gates. The poor cow had been hit by a lorry and had broken her spine. And to get her to move, he was throwing chili powder into her eyes and shoving sharp objects up her anus. And beside her walked her starving, bedraggled, scrawny little calf. Now he dragged this suffering animal to the slaughterhouse gates, but before he could hand her over to the butcher, the bastard milked her. Now, even at the last moment of her tragic life, she was still being abused. Now, if that doesn't change the heart of a man, nothing will. So I decided when I came home to study the dairy industry, and I discovered it wasn't bucolic at all. It wasn't a peaceful picture from a chocolate box. It was a grim gulag of despair, a filthy, disgusting industry. Milk is actually meat in liquid form. And I studied this industry, and I concluded that it was a vile, squalid place, and it was fundamentally a scam. And that's when I decided to make some very momentous decisions from my personal point of view, and that was to leave my career and become an advocate for social justice, really. And I know that term means different things to different people, but I decided to take all the money I'd ever made and give it away with warm hands and die broke. And I confess, so far we're right on budget. So that's the genesis of what had happened. But my experience with animals goes back much further. But if there was, if you like, a Damascene moment when I decided that my life had to change, I think those two experiences would crystallize that event.
Philip, it's really interesting hearing you talk about these really powerful experiences. I'm just wondering, do you have a kind of an idea in your mind why quite a few other people would have been to that slaughterhouse or perhaps seen that scene in India and have not been moved? Do you know what it is, why some people respond to animals and to suffering in the way you did and some don't?
Yes, I've often wondered why something which is so, I call it a BGO, a blinding glimpse of the obvious. I wonder why. And I think that people actually do see the cruelty and the nastiness of it all. And they fall into a number of camps. There are people who see it and are able to from outside the meat and dairy industry, who see it and succeed in putting it behind them, in other words, to create this kind of disconnect. And I put it down to the fact that most of them will associate their food, the food that they eat every day, with sweet, pleasant, comforting experiences in their mother's arms. When they were babies and children, their mum and dad would give them meat and dairy and chocolates to show that they cared and wanted to protect and love them. And many people associate, and so did I, our food with the caring, nurturing nature of our parents. And having experienced that kind of diet for so many years, it's very hard to have this paradigm shift. At the same time, I do think that food is highly addictive, particularly dairy. I don't think it's a food or a fad. I think it's a goddamn drug. Now, you try to talk to somebody to get them to get off smoking, for example, or crack cocaine, and they will argue incessantly as to why they've got the situation under control, and it's a preposterous lie. And meat eaters in particular are capable of that kind of mental gymnastics, if you like. So I think that's one group of people. There's another group of people who are either actively involved in the meat and dairy industry, or indeed the hunting industry, or the leather industry, and they do understand it. They do understand the cruelty, and they also have this addiction to the meat and dairy as part of their diet. But they have a more, shall we say, a more mercenary reason for it, and because that's how they earn a living. And that's why I think that Upton Sinclair got it right. He said it's impossible to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. So I think they fall into those camps. But ultimately, I think that everybody has, most people, apart from the socio and psychopaths, have a compassionate heart, but like a very obedient puppy, are able to tell their consciences to go and sit in the corner, and they do.
So, Philip, you have this realisation, you decide to change your life. How did people around you respond? How did you tell people, and what was their response to this change?
It was I had a mixed response, I must tell you. Most of my colleagues in the corporate world thought that I was either having a midlife crisis, or I'd gone insane, or they attributed a whole lot of other sinister reasons for it. There's a plot of some kind to change the world and everything in it. And it was none of those things. But I think when I first started, I initially got, first reaction was bemusement. And then some of them got quite assertive and aggressive. And I lost a lot of friends. I confess, I lost a lot of friends in that process. Because once you understand the egregious cruelty that's inflicted on these poor, powerless animal cousins of ours, you cannot stay silent anymore. You can't say, let's live and let live. That is an absolute impossible cop-out. So I guess I was fairly outspoken, and in the process I lost friendships, which I treasured great and I still miss. But it's a small price to pay. So some people rejected me, but it's extraordinary. This is going back 20 odd years. Nowadays, the more intelligent ones, if I can put it that way, now do understand the implications of what, not just what animal cruelty does, but what the consequences of the animal industrial complex is doing, not just to their children, but it's also going to have an effect in their own lifetimes. So I think they are now starting to understand that maybe I do have a point. We now know for a fact that greenhouse gas emissions from livestock release more emissions than all of transport put together. Cars, trains, buses, ships, lorries, the whole lot. We now know the dramatic effects of consuming meat and dairy on human health. The astonishing thing is that people are, I don't know if it was Goethe who said that mankind is motivated not by reason, but by ritual. Now, if nowadays they say that if you can't measure it in economic terms, it's not something that's relevant. Well, now people are realizing, in fact, this is one of the major thrusts that I've been focusing on the last 5 years, is to show that the economics of the meat and dairy industry is actually destroying entire economies. And the United States, once a very powerful, strong economy, is technically bankrupt because of their heavy addiction to meat and dairy. And they eat it in vast quantities. Now, they would need $8 trillion invested in treasury bills just to pay the interest on their Medicare liabilities. And they've got precisely zero. They could shut down every school, university, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Homeland Security, FBI, and CIA, and they still will not have enough money to pay for it. Now, that is the United States. Now, what does $8 trillion mean? That's 10 times as much as the whole of Asia will need for all of transport, telecommunications, shipping, ports for India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Laos, Cambodia, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, all of them put together times 10. Now that is what, and that's just the United States. So this is an absolutely preposterous, idiotic, stupid industry. It's Mad Hatter economics on steroids. And I'm not going to sit around and try to be polite when I have to deal with people like Barnaby Joyce who've got vested interests in perpetuating this grim, ghastly, noxious trade.
I mean, Philip, that's one of the reasons I think why you're such an outstanding animal advocate is that you can't be dismissed as, a local hippie or a, wacky kind of unemployed person. You're clearly very, very capable, very, very smart, and you know your economics, you know your stuff. So you leave your job and you set out on this path to bring justice, particularly for animals. What I'd like to get a sense of is how you make decisions about how you're going to invest your money. Because as we both know, everywhere you look, you can see suffering. So how do you go about that process?
It came as a great shock to me to come to one conclusion, and that is this. It doesn't matter where you find the intersection of the human species with every other species, and wherever that intersection is, you will find cruelty and exploitation, bar none. Even the most innocuous, benign-looking, for example, I have, as you know, many dogs. But how do they actually get here? Even a very simple-minded person with a little bit of research will find out what we actually did to turn a wolf into a little dog, and how that little dog came to live in your house through the puppy mills and through the breeders, etc. So it doesn't really matter where it happens. You can be sure it's a great deal of cruelty has taken place. So that was one realization. The next realization was the fundamental unfairness of it all. Now, in human history, only 100 billion human beings have ever lived. 7.5 billion people are alive today. And we human beings torture and kill 2 billion sentient, living, loving animals every week. We stab and suffocate 1 billion ocean animals every 8 hours. 10,000 entire species are wiped out every year because of the actions of one species. And we now face the 6th mass extinction in cosmological history. If any other organism did this, a biologist would call it a virus. It is a crime of unimaginable proportions. So now, to return directly to your question, what did I do in my own small way? I decided to do something which was really out of character for me. I decided just to do it, not to worry too much about research or picking winners or anything like that. In the past, I was always very analytical. I would think the issues through and come to a conclusion. And then I decided that it really didn't matter if I made a mistake and backed the wrong kind of organization. So in the process, I funded some projects in China and India and Laos and Cambodia and Africa and South America and some parts of Europe progressively. And I'm sure I made a lot of mistakes in the early stages. But in time, I developed an extremely good network. Professor Drucker from Harvard called them my low-cost probes. I've got a network which most organization would kill to get, and I could find out about an issue in most countries with a few phone calls. So that's how I started. But now that it's become sort of quite large, I suppose today we support about 500 projects in about 40 countries, and we focus on children, animals, the environment, the terminally ill, and aspiring youth. I call them my 5 fingers. And in order to manage, I don't manage the projects, but to manage this I call it my enchanted web. I need to use a little bit of intelligence. So I put them all into silos. Like, for example, Kindness House, an incubator for NGOs with 300 people and 45 NGOs, where 85% of the tenants in the building paid nothing at all. We paid for the rates and taxes, insurance and electricity and air conditioning, security guards, and it had offices, boardrooms, training rooms, kitchen, showers, movie theater, the whole lot. So that was Kindness House. Then we have Kindness Skies to look after the birds, the bird life. And Kindness Oceans, we have significant supporters of projects, the anti-whaling campaigns, for example, and now the anti-poaching campaigns with Sea Shepherd all around the world in every ocean. So that's Kindness Oceans. And the Kindness Streets, the animal birth control projects, largely in Asia. But also we're now moving into some of the islands in the Pacific. Then we have Kindness Farms, where we have 2,000 or 3,000 animals and a biogas plant. Many of the animals are bovine, so we take the cow dung and put it in the biogas plant. We're now 100% self-sufficient in cooking gas, 50% self-sufficient in electricity. The slurry that comes out of the gas plant is used as fertilizer to grow fruit, nuts, vegetables, and flowers. We've planted about 50,000 plants on every property. So that's the Kindness Farms. Then we set up nearby Kindness mobile restaurants, where we noticed that poor people were living in the streets in this particular city, and they were poor and they would beg for food and sleep under a tree at night or under a shop awning. And they would share whatever food they were able to beg with one of the dogs that slept with them through the night. So Trix and I came up with this idea in 2004 to set up this Kindness mobile restaurant. We signed a contract with the restaurant, and he provides a hot meal a large mound of rice on an extremely large banana leaf with a vegetable curry poured over the top and a soup called a rasam. And it's wrapped up in the banana leaf and then wrapped up in newspaper to keep it hot. Plus whatever fruit is in season, apple, pear, banana or peach, plus a bottle of water. So one of the vehicles from the shelter that we support goes around to the restaurant, picks up the food, goes to a street corner, and the poor people come out and the food is handed out to them. We started out with 1. We've got 5 at the moment. And my long-term plan is to have 100. And I'm going to brand them like Starbucks. So when I kick the bucket, some local guy can take them over and divvy them up amongst all his friends. It's very easy to run and manage. And it's brought the community together. And we tell the people very clearly, don't treat this food as charity. Treat it like a stipend. So if you see a dog has given birth to puppies, or someone is whipping a horse, or a lorry has hit a cow, go to any shop. They'll let you use their telephone, call our shelter. Every one of our shelters that we support have an ambulance, a very sturdy one, locally made, that can, with hydraulics, can even lift a cow. And they will take the animal back to the shelter. And the poor people are very happy to do that. And as a consequence of this, the people in the community now see the shelter as being part of the fabric of their daily life. And that would be a nice legacy, I think.
So, Philip, you have clearly done so very much over such a long period of time. Is there one thing that you're particularly proud of that stands out in your mind as a real achievement, say above and beyond some other things?
I don't think pride is something that exists in my lexicon. I have some satisfaction from some of the projects. I think the projects I just described give me some joy because they are fairly integrated. One thing that I smile about is that I have a very long and enduring relationship with Sea Shepherd. When I first got involved, they had nothing. When their little ship came in the first time, they had no money. They got into Docklands here in Melbourne, running on fumes. The crew were dumpster diving for food. And that night I met them, and I said, look, I like what you're doing. I said, I'm going to give you a fairly large, I won't name the amount, a large sum of money to take your immediate financial pressures off you. And I'll donate free offices in my building to you. And I'll run Sea Shepherd Australia for 2 years until you can get someone to do it properly. And Trix and I did that. We ran Sea Shepherd in our spare time. And today, if you look at, they're on every ocean. They've got, I think it's now 13 ships. It is arguably the most successful, forward-looking, intelligent, proactive organization on the planet. They're not an animal rights organization. They're a marine animal protection organization. That is a distinction. But every one of our ships are vegan. So I think that's one small achievement, and I played a very small part in it. That gives me a lot of joy.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. So, Philip, you were showing me some photos before we started recording. You've seen a lot of very distressing things. How do you remain focused and positive and proactive and moving forward, trying to make the world a better place? Do you have any advice, say, for people wondering how they navigate that?
I'm always hesitant to use myself as an example, except perhaps if you ask me to give you a very poor example. But I confess I do suffer significant bouts of sadness and of stress from time to time. For the live animal export, we put a lot of money into the Middle East, as you know. But to have our animals have their eyes stabbed out and their tendons slashed, the money that we invested and the time we invested again in the cruel hunting industry in Africa, for example, really shook me. The bear bile in many parts of Asia, including China and Laos and Vietnam, they're heartbreaking. And I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night screaming with nightmares. But I'm very fortunate. I'm extremely fortunate. I married wisely, and I know I've always got a soft place to fall. And Trix has been a marvelous wife and a friend and a carer and a protector. And I could not have done any of this without her. So that helps. But most of all, I would say that whenever I feel down and completely gutted by the ignorance and the violence and the mendacity of our so-called leaders and people in industry, and I feel that my guts have just been ripped out of me, and I think how hard it is. I just think how hard it is for the poor animal in those cages being tortured, and it seems miraculously all my pain and my suffering just disappears, and I feel rejuvenated. I'm ready to go on to the next round.
Wow. Well, Philip, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'll try.
Can you recall when you first started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
Yes, I think I could. I grew up in India, excuse me, and in the days just after the departing British Raj. And one of the things that they seemed to leave behind was this rite of passage called hunting. And as a very young teenage boy, I was taken out by the leading members of our community under shikari, which is an Indian hunter, to so-called kill my first panther. And of course, full of excitement and all that, I went out. And on the way out into the jungle in the car in the late afternoon, we stopped at a village. And the shikari and the guy with him got out, and we went into the market. And they did some bargaining to buy a tiny little goat. And I asked what the goat was for, and they said, "Oh, this is bait." So they put me back in the back seat of the car, and the little goat sat in my lap. And she'd been taken away from her mother, and she was terrified. And she warmly urinated in my lap. And we went out into the jungle to a place that the villagers had already told us a panther had been seen because they'd seen the pug marks beside the creek. And they'd already built a thing called a machan out of bamboo, and it's maybe 50 feet above the ground, bamboo lashed together. And you climb up a rope ladder and you sit on this under a piece of canvas, and with your rifle and a seal beam spotlight, and you wait. And the little goat kid is tied at the base of the tree as night falls. And I can remember the sun going down and the nocturnal animals coming out. And sure enough, soon later I heard the sound of the panther. She'd come out of the bushes, and you could hear it. Sounded like the moan of a woman. That's how a panther sounds. So the shikari handed me the rifle, and I focused the rifle, acclimatizing my eyes to the light, and I focused the rifle on the little goat, waiting for the panther to come. And the thing that struck me, and I looked at that little goat waiting there, and she was terrified and bleating and crying. And I watched her, and the thing that still sticks in my throat today, that she looked so small. She was so small. She was like a little child. In fact, she was just a child of another species. And I can remember, I came from a community where to be tough and macho was critical. And I remember so distinctly, tears coming down my eyes, feeling like I was drowning and having an asthma attack at the same time, and trembling. And I started gurgling. And of course, the panther heard me and didn't come down. And of course, there was going to be no killing of a panther that night, and for me on no other night either. The shikari took the rifle away from me, didn't say a word, but I could tell that he was absolutely disgusted and ashamed. Anyway, by the time we got back to the city, a day later, word had spread in this macho community that Philip had behaved in the most cowardly fashion. And they called me a skit. And for the fragile young boy's ego, that was a fate worse than death. And I think that's why when I was a young man like that, I always took a very keen interest in boxing, always keen to fight a bigger opponent. Being a lightweight, I'd always want to fight a welterweight, and that's how it worked. And I would always be very happy to sometimes box the instructor and hope that he'd give me a bloody nose, and I would insist that my seconds don't wipe it away. It was a foolish badge of honor, but I just wanted to send the message that I wasn't really scared to shed blood, and I wasn't too scared to shed my own either. A foolish badge of honor, of course, for an immature child. But it's at that time I realized that there was such a massive disconnect between us and the way we behaved towards, not only towards each other, but towards all the other members of the animal kingdom. But it wasn't enough to switch me to becoming an activist. I still persevered along this ridiculous, preposterous path of being people say we're carnists or carnivores. I say no, we're not. We're necrovores. Okay, we eat the rotting flesh of a murder victim. That's a necrovore, and I like saying it. I've been saying it for 10 years, and I get chastised by members of the National Party for saying so. So that was the first example.
You know, Philip, it's just so amazing, that story. One of the things that really stands out for me is the notion that, you know, we're aware that there's something going on with can hunting, and we know that people pay a lot of money to shoot animals and they're really not doing the hard yards. But even just in your childhood experience, you know, it's not really so skillful to buy a small animal and put them out for bait, is it? It's not really a fair on any level.
I've made a short film, it's called Hunting, Is This a Sport or an Ignoble Atrocity? You decide.
Yeah.
If people really want to, I think that notion of hunting being a sport should be an insult to sportsmen everywhere. I mean, what other sport involves one party determining the field of play or the rules, or where only one party will die an agonizing death? Now, that's not a sport. That is a crime perpetrated only by gutless cowards.
Okay, second question. Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
I think it's a sort of less than it's a sort of subtle change. I speak to groups, sometimes 200 people, sometimes 5,000 people, and they're all good, caring, loving people, and they all want to change the world, as long as they don't have to change themselves. But life doesn't work that way. First we change in our hearts, and then the world follows. So I think the first thing that I ever did that took a certain amount of courage under the circumstances was making that decision, not just to myself, but to make it actually quite publicly, was to say that I would not eat another animal as long as I lived. And to do it in a fairly public forum in front of people who have been close to me for many years, and very powerful people too. So I think that was the first thing that I did, but I had to do it in a very public and positive way, and do it in a way that meant I could not retreat from it. And I remember thinking on that particular day, as Confucius probably didn't say, jumping a chasm in 2 leaps is not a good idea. So I decided to just jump in boots and all, commit myself to it, and say it's never going to happen again. And I've been faithful to that promise.
Oh, wonderful. And I think perhaps for some of the younger listeners, they may not realise how, kind of what an outlier you were to say that, and how, there were issues presumably with availability of food and all the rest of it. So it is a bold statement. So if you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yes, I think everybody in the movement has had an impact. It's like throwing a rock into a river. It would be very difficult to single out any one particular person, but there are many who have brought different elements into my life, which helped me change. It's a bit like chaos theory. The flapping of a butterfly's wing in the Amazon jungles has the effect of changing weather patterns in Nebraska, and typhoons in South China Seas, and famines in Africa. So everyone's that I've met has in fact been a butterfly wing. It's the butterfly effect. But if I was forced to name some of the people, I think I would say that Paul Watson was quite an important, significant person. Someone who's taught me to be outspoken and not to worry too much about trying to curry favor is Maneka Gandhi, who's been a very, very dear friend. I'd say, funnily enough, it doesn't have anything to do with animals per se, but really my mother and Trix have been very strong, and my grandmother. In fact, because I like to be private, I don't want anyone to know I exist. I call it the Winsome Constance Kindness Project. Winsome is my mother, and Constance is my grandmother. So I think those, I've always been blessed to be in the company of very strong, intelligent, and most of all wise women, and that's I think that's a debt of gratitude I could never repay.
Wonderful. Well, what's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
The most important thing is that they've got to be utterly committed to promoting veganism. Now, I say this often, if ever I give a speech, and if I converted every single person in that audience to go vegan, I would consider my life to be an abject failure. I also used to say, I want everyone to walk out of this room today committed to become an activist. But nowadays I say we need to go one step further. I want everyone to walk out of this room and become a pro-activist. Try and anticipate the next move, and not to be so passive and polite. You don't have to be rude, but you can be forceful. You can be assertive. I mean, you've really got to get people to understand that the truth is important. Rudyard Kipling, the Anglo-Indian poet who got the Nobel, he wrote of young men dying in World War I. And if they ask you why we died, tell them that our fathers lied. That legacy of lies continues today. Everything that the average person thinks they know about the meat and dairy industry is a preposterous lie. I think the wise Chinese have a wonderful word for it, zheng jiao. Listen to the friend who tells you the truth, even when it hurts. So let's just tell the truth, fearlessly and forcefully. That is what the Sanskrit word satyagraha means, the truth force. And Brendan Kennelly in the Book of Judas wrote, if you want to serve your age, betray it. But what does that mean, to betray your age? It means expose its lies, humiliate its conceits, debunk its arrogance, and condemn them to face harsher truths. So young activists, I think it's important to serve your age. And I think, I don't know if you remember it, but the closing lines of The Bonfire of the Vanities, Judge White says, he talks about the law. He said the law is humanity's first attempt at decency. So I say to young activists or people who haven't even thought about this, decency is the key. I welcome and I encourage you to join us in this battle, in a war that decency cannot afford to lose. Because in the end, only three things matter: how deeply you're loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things that were not meant for you. Meat was not meant for you. That is the message.
Wonderful. Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would say, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say that if every human being could see every other living being as being a fellow traveler on this kindness train, what a fantastic Garden of Eden that would be. You know, I have a fairly, I've written about this quite extensively, I have a fairly apocalyptic view of the future. We're running out of time. As I say, by 2048, all our fisheries are going to be dead. This means that if any of the algorithms that I talk about, like water and human health and economics and dead zones, if any of them are true, it means that no child under the age of 5 is ever going to reach retirement age. Now, if that is even remotely true, it means that we have got this is our last and best chance to turn this ship around. And let's say we fail and we still get wiped out long before then. What a glorious and decent way to go, rather than a cruel, squalid, atrocious way to watch the dying of the light.
Goodness. Well, Philip, normally at this stage I say, what are you working on next? I know that in your case it's going to be a lot of things, but it kind of seems like a bit of a strange segue given your thoughts just then. But what are you working on next?
Well, life has thrown me a curved ball in the last couple of years, and we have some significant challenges to face. Personal challenges. So I've had to redefine or refocus my attempts. It doesn't mean we stop. We're just becoming much more focused. So we'll have fewer trips, maybe 40 or 50 speeches a year. We still have the same number of projects. We can't turn those off. I'll probably have to do a lot more. The thing that I'm trying to do now is not give too many speeches, but speak at boardrooms and conferences in the corporate community, because I think that's where I'm going to get most bang for my buck, because there are so many rallies that I can go to. There are so many animal rights conferences I can go to. But in many ways, that's we're sort of preaching to the choir. So I'm moving in areas that people would not even know about. And I'm getting into boardrooms to talk about things that they understand. And I talk in the language that they understand. And I give them timelines and action plans and reasons and justifications why this is a critically important initiative, probably the best initiative any board of directors could ever envisage. So that's what I'm doing now, and I think it's animal rights activists, of course, they don't know that I'm doing this, and that's probably a nice thing too.
Well, I'm really grateful that you gave of your time here today, Philip. I really appreciate it. If people want to find out more about your work, what will they do? Just look you up online or go to Kindness House's website, or? Well,
we have a website. It's homemade. It's arguably the worst website on the planet, but do go to it. I have a Facebook account, I guess, but because of our current situation, I haven't been on it for some considerable time. But there's a lot of material from me on it, and if there is something significantly pressing, I suppose they could contact me by email. But right now, I have I'm juggling a number of balls, and I think next year things will be different.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you do, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you for coming down to see me.
My pleasure. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about the work they do for animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.